Eleanor Rose Price sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Sterling and Associates, her 68-year-old frame, feeling suddenly too small for the heavy leather chair that had once belonged to her husband's legacy. Across the polished table, her son Robert, a man of 42 whose cold eyes mirrored the sterile fluorescent lights above, adjusted his gold watch with a flick of his wrist that signaled his utter boredom with her grief. Her daughter Sandra, 38 and draped in silk that cost more than Eleanor's first car, didn't even look up from her phone, her thumb dancing across the screen as if her mother's presence was a mere atmospheric disturbance. Then the words came, cutting through the silence like a jagged blade, as Robert leaned forward, his voice a low, calculated rasp that stripped away 40 years of dignity in a single breath. He looked directly at her, past the silver hair and the trembling hands she tried to hide in her lap, and whispered that the help doesn't get a pension, Eleanor, and that she was nothing more than the housekeeper who happened to sleep in the master bedroom for 4 decades. The air in the room tasted of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of betrayal, a scent that seemed to suffocate the memories of every meal she had cooked and every contract she had proofread since 1986. For 40 years, Eleanor had been the invisible engine of the Price family, waking at 5:30 in the morning to ensure Harold's world ran with the precision of a Swiss watch, while her own dreams of art restoration gathered dust in the attic of her mind. She had stood by him during the lean years and the windfalls, raising children who now looked at her as if she were a piece of outdated furniture, to be discarded before the house was sold to the highest bidder. The silence that followed Robert's cruel proclamation was heavy with the weight of 4 decades of silent dedication, a lifetime of making herself small so that Harold's real estate ambitions could grow tall and imposing. She felt the vision in her eyes begin to blur, her throat turning to glass as she realized that the family she had built was nothing more than a structure of greed where she had never truly been a tenant, only a servant whose contract had been abruptly terminated by a heart attack and a fraudulently altered will. The executor, a man who had shared drinks with Robert for years and who now refused to meet Eleanor's gaze, cleared his throat and continued reading the distribution of the $3.8 million estate with a clinical indifference that felt like a funeral for her future. The family mansion, the investment portfolio, and the entire real estate business were split 50-50 between the children, leaving the woman who had helped build every square inch of that empire with nothing but a single, thick brown envelope. Sandra let out a sharp, mocking laugh as Eleanor's trembling fingers pried open the seal, revealing not a check or a deed to a modest apartment, but a rusted iron skeleton key and a property tax receipt for an address in Camden, Maine. Robert's smirk widened as he told her to look on the bright side, suggesting she should be grateful they didn't leave her on the street, and instead gave her a pile of rotting wood in the middle of nowhere to call her own. They saw a defeated woman holding a worthless piece of metal, a relic of a past Harold had apparently kept hidden from everyone. And they reveled in the thought that they had finally won the war for the Price legacy by casting its architect into exile. But as Eleanor's thumb brushed against the cold, pitted surface of the iron key, a strange sensation began to pulse through her fingertips, a whisper of a secret that Robert's arrogance would never allow him to perceive. The key was 7 inches long, its bow shaped like a delicate clover, and even through the rust and the grime, it felt significantly heavier than any standard house key, carrying the weight of an untold story that was about to begin. What her children didn't know, and what the world was not yet prepared to witness, was that the moment they thought they had destroyed her was actually the first day of Eleanor Rose Price's real life. The house in Maine was not a grave for her memories, but a fortress of justice that Harold had built in the shadows, a masterpiece of planning that would eventually leave everyone who had ever underestimated her in a state of absolute, deafening silence. As she tucked the envelope into her coat pocket and stood up with a terrifying, quiet dignity, the rusted key felt like a weapon in her palm, a signal that the woman she had buried 40 years ago was finally ready to unlock the doors of her own destiny and reclaim the masterpiece of her life. If you have ever felt like a ghost in your own home, watching your sacrifices be ignored by the people you love most, or if someone has ever tried to make you believe that your best years are behind you, then you are not alone in this journey. If you have ever wondered if the person you sleep next to has a secret that could change everything you thought you knew about your own worth, stay with us until the very end of this story. Subscribe now, because what Eleanor discovers when she reaches that lonely house in Maine will prove to you that it is never too late to reclaim the masterpiece of your own life, and that justice isn't just a dream, it's a masterpiece waiting to be uncovered. Do not let them tell you that the end has come, for the transformation you are about to witness is a testament to the power of a heart that refuses to stay broken. This is the story of how the shadows finally found the light. Welcome to the narrative. To understand the depth of the silence in that boardroom, we have to travel back to the autumn of 1986, to a small sun-drenched gallery in Soho, where the air smelled of linseed oil, aged parchment, and the dizzying hope of a woman who believed she was about to change the world of art. Eleanor was 28 then, her hair a wild halo of chestnut curls, and her fingers constantly stained with the cobalt and ochre of the masterpieces she meticulously restored. She was a rising star in the conservation world, a woman who could see the soul of a painting beneath centuries of grime and neglect. That was the night she met Harold Price, a 32-year-old developer with eyes like polished slate and a smile that promised a foundation as solid as the skyscrapers he planned to build. He watched her work for 3 hours, captivated not just by the art, but by the quiet intensity of the woman who held the past in her hands. He told her that together they would build a legacy that would outlast them both, a promise that sounded like music to a girl who had spent her life preserving the beauty of others while waiting for her own story to finally begin. The first crack in that foundation appeared just 6 months later, though at the time, Eleanor mistook it for a sacrifice of love. She had been offered a prestigious 3-year fellowship in Florence, Italy, a dream that came with a studio overlooking the Arno and the chance to learn from the greatest masters of the Uffizi Gallery. It was the break of a lifetime, the kind of opportunity that defined a career. But Harold had just secured his first major land deal in Connecticut, and he begged her to stay. He knelt on the floor of their tiny apartment and told her that he could not build this empire without her by his side, that her eye for detail was the only thing that kept his chaotic world in balance. He promised that once the Millbrook project was finished, they would move to Europe together. But for now he needed his partner. Eleanor looked at the acceptance letter, felt the phantom heat of the Italian sun on her skin, and then slowly tore it into pieces. She chose the man over the masterpiece, never realizing that she was signing away the only version of herself that truly knew how to breathe. By the time they hit the 5-year mark, the vibrant colors of Eleanor's life had begun to fade into the soft, muted beiges of domestic duty. She woke every morning at 5:30 to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that marked the steady consumption of her hours. She prepared Harold's breakfast with the same precision she had once used to mix oil paints, ensuring his coffee was exactly 160 degrees, and his toast was a uniform golden brown. She managed the complex logistics of his social calendar, proofread his multi-million-dollar contracts by the dim light of the kitchen table, and organized the charity galas that made him look like a pillar of the community. She was the invisible architect of his reputation, the quiet engine that kept the Price Real Estate Group running while he took the stage. To the outside world, she was the perfect corporate wife, a graceful accessory to his rising power. But inside the 4 walls of their suburban mansion, she was becoming a ghost who only existed to serve the needs of the man who had promised her a partnership. The arrival of the children brought a new kind of labor, a relentless cycle of sacrifice that Eleanor accepted with a resilience that would eventually become her only shield. Robert was born in 1984, followed by Sandra in 1988, and as Harold's business expanded into a $3.8 million portfolio, his presence in the home evaporated. Eleanor raised them largely alone, attending every school play, every doctor appointment, and every scraped knee while Harold traveled the country chasing the next land acquisition. She became the disciplinarian, the chauffeur, and the emotional anchor for 2 children who were slowly absorbing their father's belief that the world revolved around their desires. She watched as Harold began to treat her like a high-level administrator rather than a wife, his conversations shifting from their shared dreams to the logistical failures of the household staff. She found herself apologizing for the weather, for the children's grades, and for the very space she occupied in the house she had helped him build, always believing that if she just held everything together long enough, eventually it would be her turn to breathe. As the decade of the 90s arrived, the power dynamics in the Millbrook mansion shifted from subtle to suffocating. Harold decided that Eleanor no longer needed to worry about the stress of the family finances, and he replaced her access to their joint accounts with a monthly stipend of $500. It was a humiliating transition, forcing a woman who had once managed a gallery's restoration budget to ask her husband for permission to buy a new pair of winter boots or a specific brand of olive oil. He told her it was for her own protection, a way to simplify her life so she could focus on the children. But Eleanor felt the walls of her world closing in like a tightening vice. She spent her nights staring at her professional restoration kit, hidden at the bottom of a cedar trunk in the guest room, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, now a painful reminder of the woman she had buried. She was no longer Eleanor Rose, the artist who could restore life to the dying canvas. She was simply Mrs. Price, the housekeeper who happened to have a gold ring on her finger. By the year 1996, the erosion of Eleanor's identity was nearly complete, yet she continued to pour her soul into the people who were slowly erasing her. She remembered every birthday with a hand-painted card that Robert would toss aside without a second glance. She attended every one of Sandra's equestrian competitions, standing in the rain while her daughter complained about the quality of the silk ribbons they won. She cooked every holiday meal for 30 guests, her hands trembling with exhaustion, as she served the people who spoke over her as if she were a piece of the furniture. She was the one who stayed up until 2 in the morning helping Robert with his pre-law applications, only to be told years later that he had achieved his success entirely on his own merit. She was the one who curated Sandra's first apartment in Manhattan, only to have her daughter tell her friends that her mother had no real sense of style. The more she gave, the less she seemed to exist in their eyes, until her presence in the family home was nothing more than a functional necessity, like the heat in the radiators or the light in the foyer. There were signs of a secret life that Harold kept hidden from her during those middle years, whispers of a world she was never invited to enter. Occasionally, he would disappear for 3 or 4 days at a time, claiming he had a development project in the north that required his personal attention. He would return smelling of salt air and cedar, his eyes distant and his mood unusually quiet, but when Eleanor asked for details, he would dismiss her with a wave of his hand. He told her she would not understand the complexities of land trusts and shell companies, treating her artistic mind as if it were a handicap that prevented her from grasping the realities of business. She found a property tax receipt once for an address in Camden, Maine, but when she brought it to him, he snatched it away with a coldness that left her shivering for hours. She stayed silent, because the alternative was a confrontation she was not ready to face, and because she still clung to the hope that these secrets were just his way of building a future that would eventually include her. At the 20-year mark of their marriage, the belittling became a public sport for Harold and a learned behavior for the children. During their annual anniversary dinner at the country club, Harold stood before their peers and joked that Eleanor's interest in art was a charming little hobby that kept her busy while he did the real work of the world. He laughed as he described her restoration studio as a glorified craft room, ignoring the fact that she had once been invited to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to consult on a 17th-century landscape. Robert, then a rising corporate lawyer, joined in the laughter, his voice already carrying the sharp, arrogant edge of a man who believed his mother's softness was a sign of weakness. Sandra merely checked her reflection in her butter knife, her indifference a silent validation of her father's contempt. Eleanor sat there in her silk dress, her heart feeling like a piece of dry parchment that was slowly being torn in half, yet she smiled for the cameras and poured more wine, continuing to play the role of the woman who had everything while possessing absolutely nothing. The year 2006 marked a definitive shift into a cold, transactional silence that settled over the Millbrook estate like a winter frost. Harold stopped asking for her opinion on his projects entirely, his business now a complex empire of luxury developments and high-risk investments that he discussed only with Robert. The two of them would sit in the mahogany study until the early hours of the morning, their voices a low murmur behind the heavy oak door, while Eleanor sat in the darkened living room with a cold cup of tea. She was no longer invited to the boardroom or the strategy meetings. She was expected to be the face of the family at social functions and the silent administrator of the household staff. She watched as her son became a mirror image of his father's most ruthless qualities, his eyes losing the light of childhood and becoming the hard, calculating instruments of a man who saw everyone, including his mother, as a variable to be managed. She realized then that she had not just raised children, she had raised the architects of her own invisibility, nurturing the very greed that would eventually seek to consume her. By the time she reached her 60th birthday, Eleanor felt like a tenant in a house of strangers, watching her own history be packed away into boxes. Sandra had begun to take her jewelry and heirlooms without asking, labeling them with sticky notes for her own future home in Manhattan, claiming that Eleanor had no use for such fine things anymore. Robert had started managing his father's personal affairs with a cold efficiency that left Eleanor completely out of the loop, his voice dripping with a patronizing pity whenever she asked about their retirement savings. Harold's health was beginning to fail, his heart a ticking clock that only Robert seemed to be tracking with any interest. The man Eleanor had married 40 years ago was buried under layers of corporate arrogance and hidden trusts, and the woman she had been was a distant memory that she could only find when she touched the dried oil paint on her old brushes. She was 68 years old, a woman who had spent 4 decades building a fortress for others, only to realize that the drawbridge had been raised, and she was standing outside in the cold. The final year of Harold's life was a masterclass in psychological warfare, though Eleanor was too exhausted by the demands of his care to see the battle lines being drawn. She was the one who sat by his hospital bed for 18 hours a day after his first heart attack, holding a hand that no longer squeezed back with the same affection it once had. She was the one who managed his medications, coordinated with his doctors, and kept the news of his declining health from the predatory eyes of the local press. Meanwhile, Robert and his lawyer friends were in and out of the house at all hours, their briefcases heavy with documents that they never allowed Eleanor to see. They whispered in the hallways, their eyes darting to her with a mixture of impatience and calculation, treating her like a temporary obstacle in the path of their inheritance. She caught glimpses of Harold's signature on papers that looked suspicious, his hand trembling and his eyes clouded by the heavy sedatives Robert insisted he take. But whenever she tried to intervene, her son would remind her that she was not a lawyer and that her interference was only making things worse. She remembered one night, just weeks before the end, when she found Harold staring out the window toward the north, his eyes filled with a sudden, lucid terror that she had never seen before. He tried to tell her something about a house in Maine, his voice a ragged whisper that was cut short by Robert's sudden entrance into the room. Her son had ushered her out with a cold, firm hand on her shoulder, telling her that his father was merely hallucinating and that she should go get some rest. That was the last time she ever spoke to her husband alone, the last time she saw the man she had loved beneath the mask of the developer. When he died, 6 months later, the silence that followed was not one of grief, but of anticipation. She watched as her children took control of the funeral, the estate, and the narrative of their family, leaving her to wander the empty halls of the Millbrook mansion like a ghost searching for a body. She did not know then that the rusted iron key she would soon receive was the only thing standing between her and a grave of her own making, or that the man who had erased her identity had spent 30 years building her a secret fortress. As the days leading up to the reading of the will ticked away, the atmosphere in the house turned from cold to predatory. Robert had already sent contractors to measure the master suite for a remodel, their tape measures snapping like whip cracks against the walls where Eleanor's favorite paintings still hung. Sandra had begun to clear out the linen closets, tossing Eleanor's handmade quilts into trash bags as if they were nothing more than rags, her laughter ringing through the hallways like broken glass. They stopped speaking to her at meals, communicating only through short, clipped emails about the logistical requirements of her eventual departure. Eleanor sat at the long mahogany table, eating cold toast in a room that had once been filled with the warmth of her own hospitality, realizing that she had raised monsters who saw her life's work as a debt they were finally ready to collect. She was a woman who had given everything to a family, that was now counting the seconds until she was gone. A woman who had traded her masterpiece for a shadow, never imagining that the shadow was about to reveal a secret that would change the history of the Price legacy forever. On the final morning before the meeting at Sterling and Associates, Eleanor found herself standing in the attic, looking at a portrait she had started 40 years ago and never finished. It was a self-portrait of a woman with fire in her eyes and a brush in her hand. A woman who believed that the past could be saved if you only knew where to look for the light. She touched the canvas, her fingers coming away with a faint smudge of dust that felt like the ashes of her own ambition. She realized then that her great mistake was not in the love she gave, but in the belief that she had to become invisible to be valuable. She had spent 4 decades being the silence in the room so that Harold and the children could be the noise, and now that the noise had finally deafened her, she had nothing left but the echo of her own name. She tucked the old restoration kit into the bottom of her suitcase, her heart a heavy, cold stone in her chest, and walked down the stairs to face the end of her life, unaware that the rusted key in her future was the only thing capable of unlocking the woman she had buried so long ago. What Eleanor did not yet know, and what Robert and Sandra had carefully concealed behind their expensive smiles and fraudulent amendments, was that the betrayal she was about to face was only the first act of a much larger play. The children believed they were disposing of a used-up relic, a woman whose spirit had been broken by decades of subservience and whose mind was too soft to fight back against their legal maneuvers. They saw a victim, but if they had looked closer at the way her hands remained steady, even as her heart shattered, they might have seen the artist who knew how to wait for the paint to dry before applying the next layer. They might have realized that a woman who spent 40 years restoring the masterpieces of others would eventually know exactly how to restore her own life, no matter how much damage had been done to the canvas. But as the boardroom doors swung open and the cold air of the law firm hit her face, Eleanor Rose Price was still a woman walking into the dark, carrying the weight of 40 years of wasted time and a secret that was waiting for her 600 miles to the north. The boardroom of Sterling and Associates smelled of old paper and the kind of expensive air conditioning that felt like it was freezing the blood in Eleanor's veins. She sat at the end of the long mahogany table, her hands folded tightly to hide the tremor that had started the moment Robert walked in with that practiced predatory smirk. The executor, a man named Miller who had been Harold's golfing partner for years, would not meet her eyes, focusing instead on the thick stack of legal documents that would systematically dismantle her life. Robert adjusted his cufflinks with a rhythmic click that sounded like a countdown while Sandra sighed audibly, checking her reflection in the polished surface of the table as if her mother's presence was an inconvenience to her afternoon schedule. There was a calculated cruelty in the way they did not even acknowledge the 40 years of history sitting between them, treating the woman who had nurtured them like a piece of depreciated equipment waiting to be written off the books. The voice of the executor was a flat, clinical drone that stripped the soul out of every word it uttered, reducing a lifetime of partnership to a series of numerical distributions. He began with the $3.8 million estate, listing the luxury investment portfolio and the commercial real estate holdings with the cold precision of a coroner performing an autopsy. Helena listened as the family mansion, the very walls she had painted, and the gardens she had tended for 4 decades were signed over to Robert and Sandra in a 50-50 split that felt like a physical blow to her chest. There was no mention of a widow's share, no provision for her continued residence, and no acknowledgement of the joint accounts that had suddenly and mysteriously become the sole property of the Price Estate Corporation. The betrayal was not a sudden burst of anger, but a slow, methodical erasure, a legal architecture designed by her own son to ensure she had no ground left to stand on in the world she helped build. Robert leaned forward, his eyes devoid of any warmth, as he slid a single weathered brown envelope across the expanse of the mahogany table toward his mother. He told her, with a voice like cold gravel, that since she had always been so fond of the quiet life, they were granting her the one piece of property that was not worth the effort of a commercial listing. Sandra let out a sharp, jagged laugh as Eleanor's trembling fingers pried open the seal to find a rusted iron skeleton key and a property tax receipt for an address in Camden, Maine. It was a calculated humiliation, a public declaration that the woman who had managed a multi-million-dollar household was being cast out with a pile of rotting wood and a piece of scrap metal. Robert did not even wait for her to speak before he turned back to Miller to discuss the immediate liquidation of the family's stocks, his indifference a more powerful weapon than any shouted insult could ever have been. The true depth of the conspiracy revealed itself in the small, knowing glances exchanged between Robert and the executor, a silent language of shared greed that Eleanor was never meant to decipher. She realized in that moment that the amendment to the will had been drafted in this very building, likely while Harold was drifting in and out of a morphine-induced haze in his final weeks. Her own son, the boy she had tutored through law school and whose first office she had decorated with her own hands, had used his legal expertise to trap his mother in a cage of fine print. The lawyer present was not an impartial witness, but a collaborator in a felony against his friend's widow, his silence bought with the promise of future billable hours from Robert's new empire. It was a stacked deck, a game played by men who viewed loyalty as a liability and a mother's love as a resource to be mined, until it was completely exhausted and then discarded. As the meeting drew to a close, Robert leaned in across the table, his shadow falling over Eleanor's small frame as he delivered the final devastating blow with a whisper that felt like a razor against her skin. He looked directly into her tired eyes and told her that the help does not get a pension, Eleanor, and that she should consider herself lucky they were leaving her with anything at all. He called her the housekeeper who happened to sleep in the master bedroom, a phrase that turned 40 years of shared dreams into a transaction of labor and convenience. Sandra did not look up from her phone as she added that Dad had finally shown her what she was really worth to the family, her voice dripping with a casual malice that was far more painful than a direct attack. They were stripping away her status as a wife, a mother, and a human being, reducing her to an administrative error that had finally been corrected by the firm hand of the law. The laughter that followed the revelation of the rusted key echoed through the boardroom, a hollow, mocking sound that seemed to vibrate in Eleanor's very bones. Robert joked that the main property was the perfect place for a woman of her vintage to fade away, suggesting that the salt air might finally wash the smell of turpentine off her hands. They treated the bequest as a joke, a final insult from a father they believed had shared their contempt for the woman who had been the silent engine of his success. Eleanor felt her throat turn to glass, the words of protest dying before they could reach her lips, trapped by a dignity that refused to let her break down in front of the monsters she had raised. She clutched the envelope to her chest, the cold iron of the key biting into her palm through the paper, a physical anchor in a world that had suddenly turned into a sea of shifting shadows and broken promises. Eleanor stood up slowly, her movements stiff and deliberate, a silent ghost rising from the wreckage of her own life. She did not look at the executor, nor did she acknowledge the triumphant smirks of her children as she tucked the envelope into her coat pocket and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The air outside the office was humid and thick with the smell of exhaust and indifference, a sharp contrast to the sterile refrigerator of the law firm she had just escaped. Her vision blurred at the edges, a grey fog creeping in that made the sidewalk feel like it was tilting beneath her feet, yet she refused to stumble. She walked 3 blocks to her car before she allowed her knees to give way, leaning against the cold metal of the door as a silent, shaking sob racked her chest, not for the money she had lost, but for the realization that the people she loved most had been waiting decades for the chance to erase her. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in psychological demolition, a steady erosion of the sanctuary she had called home for 40 years. Robert did not even wait for the funeral flowers to wilt before he sent a crew of contractors into the house, their heavy boots thumping through the hallways and their tape measures snapping like whip cracks against the walls. They measured the master suite for a remodel, while Eleanor was still sitting at the kitchen table trying to swallow a piece of dry toast, their conversations about floor plans and structural changes happening right over her head, as if she were a piece of the furniture they were planning to replace. Robert moved his entire legal office into her bedroom within the first week, forcing her to relocate to the drafty guest room at the end of the hall, where the radiator hissed and the windows rattled in the wind. He changed the Wi-Fi password without a word, cutting off her only link to the outside world. his silence a wall that grew higher with every passing hour. Sandra's cruelty was of a different, more intimate kind, a systematic raiding of Eleanor's history that felt like a series of small stinging cuts. She spent her afternoons moving through the house with a roll of neon green sticky notes, labeling the jewelry, the fine linens, and the heirloom silver as her own property, her eyes scanning the rooms for anything of value with the cold hunger of a scavenger. She took the pearl necklace Harold had given Eleanor for their 25th anniversary right off the vanity, telling her mother with a patronizing pat on the shoulder that she did not have any galas left to attend anyway. When Eleanor tried to protest, Sandra merely laughed and reminded her that according to the will, everything in the house belonged to the heirs, and that she should be grateful they were not charging her rent for the time she was taking to pack. It was a daily ritual of theft and invisibility, a daughter stripping her mother of her identity, one piece of silk and 1 gram of gold at a time. The sound of the hammer hitting the wooden stake in the front lawn was a noise that Eleanor would hear in her nightmares for years to come. She stood at the window of the living room, watching as 2 men in orange vests pounded a bright red "for sale" sign into the grass she had spent decades weeding and watering. Robert had not even mentioned the listing to her, his only communication being a short, clipped email about the date the new owners would be taking possession of the property. The house she had built into a home, the place where she had nursed her children through fevers and celebrated 40 years of holidays, was being sold off like a piece of distressed inventory before she had even finished packing her first suitcase. She watched as the neighbors looked on from their porches with a mixture of pity and curiosity, none of them stepping forward to help the woman who had once been the heart of their community, their silence a final validation of her new status as a non-person. There was a moment in the second week when the cruelty became physical, a small accident that carried the weight of a deliberate execution. Sandra was clearing out the china cabinet, tossing the everyday plates into cardboard boxes with a reckless disregard for the noise, when she reached for Eleanor's favorite porcelain tea set, the one her grandmother had brought over from England. Eleanor had moved toward her, her hand outstretched in a rare moment of desperation, but Sandra's thumb slipped, and the delicate teapot shattered against the hardwood floor into 1,000 jagged white shards. Sandra did not even apologize, merely looking down at the wreckage with a bored expression before telling her mother that it was probably for the best, as there would not be much room for such fragile things in a rotting shack in Maine. The sight of her history lying in pieces on the floor felt like a metaphor for her entire existence, a delicate thing broken by the hands of people who had no concept of the value of what they were destroying. The final days in the Millbrook mansion were spent in a state of absolute hollowed-out invisibility, a ghost wandering through a house that was already being lived in by the shadows of her children's greed. They stopped speaking to her at the table, their conversations revolving entirely around the luxury condos they were going to buy and the vacations they were planning with their newfound wealth. Robert would walk through the room where Eleanor was sitting and turn off the lights, as if he literally could not see her occupying the space, his indifference a cold vacuum that seemed to suck the air out of her lungs. She spent her nights in the guest room, her belongings reduced to 2 suitcases and a single wooden trunk, listening to the laughter of her children in the study below as they toasted to their future over her husband's expensive scotch. They had already erased her from the narrative of the family, treating her departure as a long-overdue cleaning of a cluttered room. On the morning of her departure, Eleanor found Sandra in the hallway with a stack of black trash bags, already clearing out the last of the items from the master suite. Her daughter was tossing Eleanor's handmade quilts and personal photographs into the plastic bags with a clinical efficiency that made Eleanor's stomach churn with a cold, acidic bile. When Eleanor asked for the photos of her parents, Sandra did not even look up, telling her that they were all digital now anyway and that there was no point in carrying old paper halfway across the country. Eleanor realized then that there was no bottom to their cruelty, no limit to how much they were willing to destroy to ensure they never had to look at the evidence of her sacrifice again. She walked to the attic one last time, her heart a heavy stone in her chest, and found her old restoration kit hidden at the bottom of a cedar chest, the only part of her soul that they had not found a way to label or break. Eleanor walked down the stairs for the final time, her 2 suitcases clutched in her hands and the brown envelope tucked deep into her coat pocket like a hidden weapon. She did not ask for help with the bags, and neither Robert nor Sandra offered, both of them standing in the foyer with their arms crossed, watching the clock as if they were waiting for a delivery person to leave. As she reached the front door, the very door she had opened thousands of times to welcome them home, she stopped and turned to look at the son and daughter who shared her blood, but none of her spirit. She did not cry, and she did not beg for a single dollar more than the rusted key they had mocked, her voice coming out as a quiet, terrifyingly steady whisper that cut through the silence of the hall. She told them that they had not just taken her home, they had taken the last reason she had to ever look back, and as she stepped out into the cold morning air, she did not even bother to close the door behind her, leaving the monster she had raised to face the silence of the house they had stolen. Before we follow Eleanor into the freezing northern air, I want you to take a moment and think about your own journey. Have you ever been in a situation where it felt like every door had been slammed in your face, and the only path left was one you never chose? What do you think Eleanor will find when she pulls into that driveway at 14 Blackwood Lane? Leave your guess in the comments right now, because your intuition might be sharper than you think. If you have ever felt like you were at a point of no return, comment the word rebuild below so we can share in the strength of starting over. Now, as the sun begins to dip behind the jagged horizon of the New England coastline, we watch as Eleanor pushes her old station wagon north for 6.5 hours, the familiar skyline of Connecticut fading into a grey smudge in her rearview mirror. The landscape begins to transform, the manicured suburban lawns giving way to dense, dark forests of gnarled pine and the sharp, unforgiving edges of granite cliffs that have stood against the Atlantic for centuries. She arrived in Camden as the last of the light was being swallowed by a bruised purple sky, the air turning a biting 10 degrees colder the moment she crossed the Maine border. The gravel of 14 Blackwood Lane crunched under her tires like breaking bone, leading her toward a 3-story Victorian that stood like a silent sentinel overlooking the violent, rhythmic crashing of the waves below. This was the painted lady Harold had bought in secret 30 years ago, but the name felt like a cruel joke as Eleanor stepped out of the car and looked at the peeling grey shingles that flaked away like dead skin in the salt-laden wind. The wraparound porch had a dangerous, weary sag on the left side, and the 8-acre lot was a wild, overgrown tangle of salt grass and wind-swept trees that seemed to be trying to reclaim the structure for the earth. It did not look like a home. It looked like a graveyard for a woman's dignity. A final, rotting punchline to a joke Robert and Sandra had been telling for years behind her back as they plotted her eventual exile to this lonely cliff. The iron skeleton key felt heavy and cold in her pocket, a 7-inch weight of rusted metal that promised access to a life she no longer recognized. To her surprise, the front door was not even locked, swinging open with a long, morning whistle of a groan that echoed through the hollow ribcage of the house. As she stepped into the foyer, the smell of old cedar, damp earth, and 40 years of neglect hit her like a physical blow, making her lungs tighten with the sudden realization of her absolute isolation. The interior was a cavern of shadows, the high ceilings lost in the gloom, and the wallpaper hanging in long, floral strips that looked like discarded bandages. There was no heat, no light, and no sound except for the frantic beating of her own heart against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed out of place in such a tomb. She stood in the center of the dust-covered floorboards, clutching her 2 small suitcases, feeling smaller than she ever had in the boardroom of Sterling and Associates, wondering if the walls themselves were mocking the 40 years of silence she had offered her family. That first night was a descent into a darkness so profound that Eleanor felt as if she were being buried alive under the weight of her own history. She had no bed, no linens, and no furniture to claim as her own, so she spread her 2 winter coats on the hard wooden floor of what might have once been a parlor. The house did not just sit in the silence, it breathed with a series of unsettling creaks and moans as the Maine wind searched for every crack in the window frames and every loose shingle on the roof. She lay there staring at the ceiling she could not see, her mind replaying the last 30 days in a relentless loop of betrayal and loss. She could still hear the snap of the contractor's tape measures and the sharp, jagged laughter of her daughter as she tossed 40 years of memories into black plastic trash bags. The silence of the Maine coast was not peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of her chest. leaving her to face the terrifying reality that she was a 68-year-old woman with no money, no family, and no future beyond these decaying walls. The breakdown did not come with a scream or a dramatic gesture, but with a slow, agonizing realization that her internal mantra had been a lie she told herself to survive. For 4 decades, she had whispered that if she just held everything together, it would eventually be her turn to breathe. But as she lay on that cold floor, her ribs began to ache with a sorrow that was older than the house itself. She cried until her throat felt like it was lined with broken glass, the sobs racking her slender frame in the rhythmic time of the ocean outside. She felt the crushing weight of every meal cooked for ungrateful mouths, every contract proofread for a man who had erased her name, and every dream she had deferred until it had turned to dust in the attic of her mind. The fear of dying alone in this rotting Victorian, of her body being found weeks later by a stranger, was a cold, sharp knife that twisted in her gut, making her wonder if Robert had been right after all, and that she was nothing more than a used-up relic of a life that never truly belonged to her. Sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of the morning, a shallow and restless state that was broken by the first light of a sun she had forgotten existed. As the grey fog began to lift, a sharp, silvery blue light began to filter through the grime-streaked windows, dancing across the dust motes and illuminating the intricate woodwork of the grand staircase. Eleanor sat up, her body stiff and protesting from the cold floor, and watched as the first golden rays of the Atlantic sun flooded the room with a blinding, holy intensity. In that light, the house began to transform, the shadows retreating to reveal that the bones of the structure were not rotting but magnificent and sturdy, crafted with a level of detail that modern builders could never hope to replicate. She saw the hand-carved molding, the heavy marble of the fireplace, and the way the light caught the grain of the white oak floors, and for the first time in 30 days she felt a tiny, flickering spark of curiosity that was stronger than her despair, a whisper of potential in the decay. She stood up slowly, her knees cracking like dry wood, and walked to the window that overlooked the jagged cliff and the endless expanse of the steel-blue Atlantic. The sight was terrifyingly beautiful, a raw display of power that made her own problems feel like grains of sand in the face of the tide. She realized then that the silence of this place was not a vacuum, but a canvas, a space that was finally, for the first time in 40 years, devoid of the noise of Harold's ambitions and Robert's cruelty. She went to the sink and turned the heavy brass faucet, watching as a stream of rusty, freezing water sputtered to life, splashing against the porcelain with a sound that felt like a challenge. She washed her face with the cold water until her skin stung, the shock of it clearing the cobwebs of the night from her mind and bringing a steady, focused clarity to her eyes. She was not going to die here. She was going to exist, and for a woman who had spent a lifetime being a ghost, simply existing felt like the first act of a revolution against those who sought to erase her. Her hands, though trembling slightly from the cold, began to move with a familiar, muscle memory precision as she opened her suitcase and retrieved her professional restoration kit. She touched the smooth wooden handles of her brushes and the cool metal of her scrapers, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine rising from the case like a prayer from her past. She looked at the peeling wallpaper and the layers of grime on the windows and did not see a ruin. She saw a masterpiece that had been neglected, much like the paintings she had once brought back to life in Soho. The internal mantra that had sustained her for 40 years finally died in that golden morning light, replaced by a new, terrifyingly quiet thought that made her spine straighten with a dignity Robert would never understand. She realized that she had not been left with nothing, but had finally been stripped of everything that was preventing her from being herself. And as she picked up a small scraper to test the edge of a loose piece of molding, Eleanor Rose Price took the first breath of her real life. The house seemed to settle around her as she began the slow, methodical work of reclaiming the parlor, the rhythmic sound of her scraper against the wood, providing a new soundtrack to her solitude. She worked until her shoulders burned and her fingers were stained with the dust of a century, ignoring the hunger in her stomach and the cold that still lingered in the corners of the room. She found that the more she focused on the physical restoration of the space, the more the fractured pieces of her own identity began to align. as if she were conserving her own soul alongside the Victorian woodwork. She was no longer waiting for a turn that would never come. She was taking it with both hands, using the very skills that Harold had once dismissed as a charming little hobby to build a fortress out of her exile. By the time the sun began to set again, the parlor was still far from finished, but it was no longer a tomb. It was a workspace, a signal to the universe that the artist had returned to the studio and that the restoration of Eleanor Price had officially begun. Eleanor worked with a relentless, quiet intensity, her hands moving in the rhythmic patterns of a woman who had spent 4 decades erasing the messes of others. On the 14th day of her exile, she found herself in the master suite on the 2nd floor, a room that smelled of salt air and the deep resinous scent of the built-in cedar wardrobe that dominated the far wall. The wood was dull, choked by layers of grime and neglect, but as she applied the linseed oil and rubbed with a steady circular motion, the rich, dark grain began to bleed back to life under her touch. Her fingers brushed against a peculiar indentation deep within the wardrobe interior, a small circular knot that felt unusually smooth against her skin. It was not a flaw in the timber, but a deliberate piece of craftsmanship, a hidden latch disguised by the natural patterns of the wood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone, as she realized that the rusted iron key she had carried since the boardroom was not meant for a door but for this very moment of silence. She retrieved the 7-inch iron key from her pocket, its clover-shaped bow feeling cold and heavy in her palm, as if it were vibrating with the weight of the secrets it held. She had scrubbed the rust away with vinegar and salt, until the serial number etched into the shank was visible, a series of digits that felt like a code to a life she had long ago forgotten. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she inserted the key into the hidden hole and turned it clockwise, listening for the sound of a mechanism that had been waiting 30 years to be awakened. There was a deep metallic thud, a sound of heavy bolts sliding back into a velvet-lined chamber, and the back panel of the wardrobe began to swing inward with a slow, graceful precision. A rush of air hit her face, carrying a scent that made her knees buckle and her vision swim with a sudden overwhelming nostalgia. The sharp, intoxicating tang of turpentine, the sweet, heavy notes of linseed oil, and the dry, dusty smell of aged canvas. Behind the false wall lay a hidden gallery, a space 15 feet deep and 20 feet wide, where 47 oil paintings stood on custom-built racks, their surfaces shielded by heavy silk sheets. Eleanor stepped into the room, her breath hitching in her throat as she reached out to pull back the first piece of fabric, the silk sliding away with a sound like a distant sigh. In the dim, filtered light, she saw her own face staring back at her, a portrait of a woman at 28, her eyes filled with the fire of the Soho gallery and her hands stained with the colors of a masterpiece. Harold had commissioned it in secret from her favorite artist, preserving the woman she used to be even as he helped to bury her in the suburbs. As she moved from rack to rack, uncovering landscapes and portraits by mid-century American masters, the sheer magnitude of the collection began to sink in, a hoard of museum-quality works that Harold had been quietly acquiring for decades. This was not just a house, it was a vault, a fortress built in the shadows, to protect a legacy that Robert's greed would never be allowed to touch. Tucked into a small alcove at the back of the hidden room was a heavy leather satchel, its surface cracked with age, but its contents preserved with a meticulous, almost desperate care. Inside, Eleanor found a 12-page letter written in Harold's familiar looping script, the ink still dark and sharp against the ivory parchment. As she began to read, his voice seemed to fill the silent room, a low murmur of confession and regret that reached across the grave to touch her heart. He wrote of the day he realized Robert's true nature, of the cold, calculating greed he saw in his son's eyes even then, and of his own cowardice in failing to stop it. He confessed that the Camden house was his penance and her fortress, a place where she could finally breathe again, away from the monsters they had raised. He told her that she was the only masterpiece he had ever truly known, and that every painting in this room was a silent apology for every dream he had asked her to defer in the name of his own ambition. But the letter contained more than just emotional weight. It was a blueprint for her survival and a weapon for her defense. Harold had meticulously documented every instance where Robert had forced his hand, listing the exact dates and times his son had brought fraudulent amendments to his bedside. He included a forensic medical report from a private physician, proving that in his final months, the heavy sedatives Robert insisted he take had rendered him legally incompetent to sign any binding documents. There were records of secret bank accounts Robert had used to funnel funds from the family business into his own private shell companies, a paper trail of felony fraud that would strip away his legal career in a single afternoon. Eleanor clutched the pages to her chest, the cold numbness that had paralyzed her in the boardroom finally beginning to melt away, replaced by a searing, white-hot heat of determination. She realized then that she held the power to not only reclaim her home, but to dismantle the very empire of greed her children had built upon her silence. The practical reality of the discovery began to settle over her, as she tabulated the values listed in the trust documents Harold had included in the satchel. The 47 paintings were valued at over $1 million, a fortune in art that had been held in a private trust in her name since 1995, completely shielded from the probate of the public will. The 8-acre coastal land, which Robert and Sandra had mocked as a rotting shack, was worth an additional $1 million due to its prime location and the rare, undisturbed cliffs it commanded. She was not a beggar standing at the gates of her children's mercy. She was a woman of significant independent wealth, the mistress of a coastal estate that was now the most valuable asset in the entire Price family history. The irony was a bitter, satisfying taste on her tongue as she realized that the nothing they had left her with was actually the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her, a masterpiece of planning that Harold had hidden in plain sight for 30 years. A soft knock at the open front door echoed through the house, followed by the familiar no-nonsense voice of Catherine Wells, who appeared in the doorway of the parlor, carrying a thermos of coffee and a heavy-duty flashlight. She took one look at Eleanor standing by the open wardrobe, the letter in one hand and the iron key in the other, and she did not ask a single question. She poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Eleanor, her eyes scanning the hidden gallery with the practiced, analytical gaze of a former defense attorney who had seen everything and believed nothing. Catherine sat on the edge of a packing crate and told Eleanor that a woman like her does not get left with nothing because she was the one holding the something together for 40 years. She promised that together they would turn these documents into a cage for the monsters in Connecticut, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of Eleanor's emotions. In that moment, the silence of the house was no longer a tomb, but a strategy room where two women were beginning to map out a campaign of justice that would leave everyone silent. Eleanor felt the steadiness return to her hands as she touched the frame of the portrait of her 28-year-old self, the fire in the painted eyes now mirrored in her own silver gaze. The restoration of the house was no longer a hobby to pass the time. It was a physical manifestation of her own reconstruction, a way to polish the bones of her life until they shone with a terrifying, quiet power. She began to see the sagging porch and the peeling shingles as layers of grime that she would remove with the same precision she used on an old master, revealing the vibrant, resilient beauty that had been hiding beneath the neglect. She was the architect of her own destiny now, armed with the evidence of her son's betrayal and the wealth of her husband's secret guilt. As she looked out over the Atlantic, the waves crashing against the cliffs with a rhythmic, violent energy, Eleanor realized that the contract of her silence had finally expired, and the world was about to learn that the help does not just get a pension, she gets the last word. The days following the discovery were a blur of focused, strategic activity, as Catherine used her legal connections to bring a high-end appraiser from New York to verify the collection. Silas, the local handyman, arrived with a team of carpenters to begin the structural repairs on the porch, his eyes widening in respect as he watched Eleanor sand the intricate molding of the parlor with a professional's touch. The community of Camden began to circle around the house on the cliff, bringing offerings of clam chowder and warm bread, their gestures of kindness a sharp, healing contrast to the calculated indifference of the life she had left behind. Eleanor found that the more she shared her story with these strangers, the less power Robert's words had over her soul. The label of housekeeper washing away in the salt air. She was a restorer, a woman who knew how to find the light in the dark, and she was preparing to apply the final, devastating layer of varnish to the masterpiece of her life's work. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long golden shadow across the white oak floors, Eleanor sat at the small kitchen table with the forensic medical report spread before her. She was no longer the woman who had walked out of the boardroom with her head bowed. She was a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. She thought of Robert's gold watch and Sandra's silk dresses, bought with the money they had stolen from a man who was too drugged to know his own name, and she felt a cold clinical satisfaction in the knowledge of what was coming for them. The rusted iron key was now a symbol of her authority, the bridge between the ghost she had been and the woman she was becoming. She picked up a pen and began to draft a single short email to her children, her voice in the text as calm and cold as the Maine winter, inviting them to come and see the rotting shack they had given her, knowing that their greed would bring them running into the very trap their father had spent 30 years setting. The news of her discovery was not yet public, but the shift in the atmosphere around the Painted Lady was impossible to ignore, drawing the curious eyes of the town toward the cliffside. Eleanor spent her nights in the hidden gallery, her fingers tracing the textures of the canvases as she identified the minor environmental damage that required her expertise. The act of conservation was her meditation, each stroke of her brush a quiet reclamation of the talent she had suppressed to make room for Harold's noise. She realized that her husband had not just left her a collection of art. He had left her a way to find herself again, a path back to the Soho Gallery and the woman who held the past in her hands. Catherine would sit in the shadows, her presence a silent validation of Eleanor's worth, helping her to understand that the justice they were seeking was not just for the money, but for the 40 years of stolen time that could never be repaid. By the end of the month, the house was no longer a ruin, but a beacon of light that stood defiantly against the Atlantic gales, its vibrant new colors a signal of Eleanor's return. She had replaced the broken panes of glass with hand-blown replicas that filtered the morning sun into patterns of amber and blue, turning the parlor into a sanctuary of light. She was ready for the confrontation that she knew was coming, her heart no longer a heavy stone, but a steady, beating drum of anticipation. She looked at the letter one last time, Harold's final words echoing in her mind like a promise that the shadows were finally finding the light. The stage was set, the evidence was gathered, and the woman who had been left with nothing was now the master of a fortress that would leave the world silent. But as she clicked send on the email to Robert and Sandra, a sudden sharp noise from the porch made her freeze, the sound of heavy footsteps that suggested her children were already closer than she ever imagined. 18 months had passed since the night Eleanor Rose Price first slept on the cold wooden floor of a rotting Victorian tomb, and the transformation of 14 Blackwood Lane was now a living testament to the power of a woman who had finally learned to breathe. The house, once a peeling grey ghost of a building, stood proudly against the Atlantic horizon as a vibrant painted lady, its shingles a deep cornflower blue, accented by crisp cream trim and terracotta details that glowed like embers in the morning light. The sagging porch had been replaced with reinforced white oak that felt as solid as a cathedral floor, and the overgrown tangle of saltgrass had been meticulously curated into a sprawling art garden where wildflower paths meandered toward the jagged cliffs. Eleanor stood on that porch, 68 years of age but moving with the effortless grace of a woman 30 years younger, her silver hair catching the sun and her silk linen jumpsuit flowing in the salt breeze. The smell of fresh lavender and sea spray had replaced the scent of damp earth and neglect, and the house no longer groaned in the wind. It hummed with the quiet, industrious energy of a masterpiece that had been restored to its original glory. The high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine cut through the rhythmic crashing of the waves below, and Eleanor watched with a cold, clinical detachment as a silver Porsche 911 navigated the gravel driveway with a frantic, desperate speed. Robert stepped out of the car first, his $4,000 suit looking wrinkled, and his face a sickly shade of grey that even the expensive Connecticut tan couldn't hide, his eyes darting toward the magnificent structure with a mixture of shock and predatory greed. Sandra followed, her high heels catching in the new gravel as she adjusted her designer sunglasses, her expression shifting from a practiced sneer of contempt to a hollow, wide-eyed stare as she processed the sight of her mother standing in a position of absolute, undeniable power. They had come because the news of the Price coastal residency had finally reached the social circles of Manhattan. They feature in Architectural Digest, highlighting a $3.2 million estate that they believed they had successfully discarded. They saw a woman who was supposed to be a beggar in a shack, but instead they found a queen in a fortress, and the silence that followed their arrival was the sound of two predators realizing they had walked into a trap of their own making. Robert was the first to speak, his voice a frantic, overcompensated tumble of words that attempted to rewrite 18 months of cruelty into a narrative of concern and clerical oversight. He walked toward the porch steps, his hands gesturing broadly as he claimed there had been a massive misunderstanding at the law firm, a series of technical errors in the probate process that he and his partners were now eager to rectify for her benefit. He spoke of family loyalty and the need to manage such a complex property, his eyes never leaving the hand-carved molding of the front door. Already mentally calculating the commission on a potential sale, Sandra chimed in with a forced, high-pitched giggle, trying to brush past her mother to enter the house, while commenting on how she always knew the place had potential and how she was ready to help with the final interior decorating. They talked over each other, a cacophony of justification and fake affection that filled the salt air with the stench of their hypocrisy, acting as if the trash bags and the boardroom insults had never happened, as if they hadn't spent 40 years treating this woman like a piece of depreciated equipment. Eleanor did not move from the center of the porch, her presence a physical barrier that seemed to radiate a cold, impenetrable dignity that made the air around her feel 10 degrees cooler. She waited until the silence of the cliffs finally swallowed Robert's excuses, her gaze fixed on her son with a level of clarity that made him stop mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open like a broken hinge. When she spoke, her voice was a quiet, razor-sharp whisper that carried more authority than any shouted command, a sound that had been 40 years in the making. She looked Robert directly in the eyes and told him that he had been mistaken in the boardroom when he said the help doesn't get a pension because she was no longer the help. She was the landlord of the only property that currently mattered in the Price family portfolio. She watched the color drain from his face as she added that she had spent 4 decades being invisible so that he could feel powerful, but that the contract of her silence had expired the moment he handed her a rusted key and called her a housekeeper. From the pocket of her elegant jumpsuit, Eleanor produced a single thin blue folder, the forensic medical report, and the 12-page letter from Harold that Catherine had spent months turning into a legal guillotine. She did not raise her voice as she explained the contents, detailing the exact dates and times Robert had manipulated his dying father, the chemical signatures of the drugs in Harold's system, and the documented trail of the embezzled funds from the family business. She told them that the $3.8 million inheritance they had stolen was currently being frozen by the state bar, and that a criminal investigation into elder financial abuse and document fraud had already been opened in her name. Robert turned a terrifying shade of purple, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he realized that every legal move he had made to trap her had been turned into a cage for himself. Sandra let out a sharp, jagged cry of protest, her vanity finally crumbling as she realized the Manhattan apartment and the silk dresses were built on a foundation of sand that was currently being washed away by her mother's words. The confrontation shifted as Sandra tried to collapse into a theatrical display of grief, reaching out to grab Eleanor's hand with a plea for forgiveness that was as transparent as a piece of cheap glass. She cried about her own insecurities and how her father had pressured them, her voice a desperate whine that attempted to find a soft spot in the woman she had once mocked for her softness. Eleanor stepped back, her movement a clean, decisive break from the daughter she no longer recognized, her eyes devoid of the pity Sandra was hunting for. She told Sandra that she didn't just steal a house or a bank account. She had stolen the last 6 months of peace that her father deserved, turning a man's final days into a battlefield of greed. That was the only debt that could never be forgiven, the only piece of the masterpiece that could never be restored. And as Eleanor spoke, the realization that there would be no reconciliation, no check, and no mercy finally settled over the children like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Robert tried one final desperate play, a snarl of legal threats and empty bravado that claimed he would tie this house up in court for the next 20 years before he let her keep a single painting. He moved toward her, as if he could physically intimidate the woman he had spent a lifetime subverting, his face contorted with a rage that was born of pure, impotent loss. Eleanor did not flinch, her chin remaining level, as she informed him that Catherine Wells was currently inside the house on a conference call with the district attorney, and that if he didn't leave her property within the next 60 seconds, his arrest would happen on the front lawn of the house he had called a rotting shack. The mention of the high-stakes defense attorney was the final blow, the sound of the iron gate slamming shut on Robert's career and his future. He looked at the house, the paintings he could now see through the windows, and the mother he had never truly known, and he realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere left to go but down. The silence that followed their departure was the most magnificent sound Eleanor had ever heard, a deep, resonant peace that seemed to vibrate in the very timbre of the painted lady. She watched the silver Porsche roar back down the driveway, the dust settling slowly over the wildflower paths as the monsters she had raised vanished from the landscape of her new life. The poetic justice of their downfall was already in motion, a clockwork mechanism of their own making that would ensure they suffered the exact ironies they had practiced. Robert, the lawyer who believed he was above the letter of the law, was disbarred within 3 months, his name erased from the firm he had sought to lead, and his future spent in a minimum security facility for document fraud. He was destroyed by a single letter he didn't know existed, a victim of the very legal precision he had used as a weapon against his mother. Sandra, who valued nothing but the best addresses and the highest social circles, lost her Manhattan apartment to foreclosure and ended up working as a junior assistant to the very socialites she had once looked down upon, living in a studio apartment that was smaller than Eleanor's new walk-in closet. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, casting a long golden shadow across the porch where she stood, Eleanor Rose Price finally allowed the mask of the restorer to slip. She stood alone against the wind, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood of the railing she had sanded with her own hands, and she let out a single, jagged sob of relief that seemed to carry the weight of 40 years of wasted time. It was not a cry of sorrow, but a release of the pressure that had been building since 1986, a final cleansing of the shadows that had lived in her heart for far too long. She looked out at the Atlantic, the water turning to liquid gold under the touch of the dying sun, and she smiled as she watched the light dance across the waves. The woman she had buried 40 years ago had finally found her way home, and the house that had left everyone silent was now the only place in the world where she could finally, for the first time in her life, hear the sound of her own voice. 2 years have passed since the dust settled on the gravel driveway of 14 Blackwood Lane, and the silence that once felt like a tomb has transformed into a symphony of creative purpose. Eleanor Rose Price is now 70 years old, but her reflection in the polished glass of the sunroom shows a woman whose eyes carry the vibrant clarity of a northern spring rather than the winter of her exile. The Painted Lady has become more than a home, as it is now the Harold Price Foundation for Emerging Artists, a sanctuary where the smell of fresh cedar and salt air mingles with the intoxicating scent of oil paints and aging parchment. Every morning at 6:30, Eleanor walks through the art garden, her fingers brushing against the dew-covered lavender and the resilient stalks of sea kale as she makes her way to the communal kitchen. She watches as 4 young residents, scholars from across the country, sip their coffee and discuss the restoration of the 19th century landscapes she has entrusted to their care. The house no longer mourns the past because it is too busy nurturing the future, its vibrant blue shingles standing as a beacon for those who believe that beauty is something worth fighting for. Her attic studio is a cathedral of light, where the Atlantic sun filters through the hand-blown glass panes in patterns of amber and sapphire, illuminating the masterpiece she is currently bringing back to life. Eleanor spends her afternoon seated at her professional easel, her hands moving with a surgical precision that has become legendary in the world of art conservation. She is no longer the invisible administrator of the empire of another man, as she is the master of her own craft, teaching the next generation that the most important part of any restoration is finding the light that was hidden beneath the grime. She remembers the cold, sterile boardroom in Connecticut as if it were a scene from the life of someone else, a distant memory that has no power over the woman who now holds the past in her steady fingers. The silence of the Maine coast is her greatest ally, a space where she can finally hear the thoughts she had suppressed for 40 years, turning the void of her abandonment into a reservoir of creative strength. She finds a profound, quiet joy in the physical labor of her work, realizing that every stroke of her brush is a reclamation of the time Robert and Sandra tried to steal from her heart. The mail arrives at noon, often carrying a single, cream-colored envelope from Sandra, whose letters have changed from frantic demands for money to short, humble accounts of her new life in the city. The daughter of Eleanor writes of the exhaustion of her junior assistant job and the small, hard-won satisfaction of paying her own rent, her words no longer dripping with the casual malice of the Manhattan socialite. Eleanor reads these letters with a heart that is calm and guarded, offering a partial reconciliation that is built on the foundation of healthy boundaries rather than the old patterns of sacrifice. She has not invited Sandra back to the Painted Lady, nor has she replied to the desperate collect calls from the facility where Robert is serving his sentence for document fraud. She has learned that forgiveness does not require a return to the fire, and that her peace is a masterpiece that requires constant protection from the predators of her past. She is a woman who welcomes her family from a position of autonomy, a mother who has finally learned that she cannot restore a soul that refuses to recognize its own damage and greed. As the evening sun begins its descent toward the jagged horizon, casting a long golden shadow across the white oak floors of the parlor, Eleanor sits with Catherine Wells on the wrap-around porch. They watch the waves crash against the granite cliffs with a rhythmic, violent energy that no longer feels threatening, but like the steady heartbeat of a world that is finally in balance. Eleanor turns to her friend, her voice a soft, resonant whisper that carries the wisdom of 7 decades, and tells her that she spent a lifetime thinking the iron key was the most important thing Harold ever gave her. She realizes now that the house was just a vessel, and the real discovery was the woman she had buried 40 years ago beneath the beiges and the breakfasts of her suburban prison. She is no longer waiting for a turn that will never come, because she has built a world where every breath is her own, a masterpiece of freedom that was uncovered in the very place her children thought she would go to die. The sunset over the Atlantic is a final, glowing validation of her journey, a signal that the restoration of Eleanor Rose Price is complete and that the rest of her life is a blank, beautiful canvas. My heart overflows with a profound sense of gratitude for you having stayed with Eleanor in every moment of this long and difficult journey from the shadows into the light. If you have ever felt like a ghost in your own home, watching your sacrifices be ignored by the people you love most, or if someone has ever tried to make you believe that your best years are behind you, then this story was written specifically for your soul. If you have ever wondered if the person you sleep next to has a secret that could change everything you thought you knew about your own worth, remember that you are the architect of your own dignity. We share these stories because they remind us that no matter how much damage has been done to the canvas of our lives, the light is always waiting to be rediscovered by those who have the courage to pick up the brush. You are not alone in your struggle, and the silence you face today may very well be the foundation of the masterpiece you will build tomorrow. Your presence here is a testament to the fact that justice and beauty are worth seeking, no matter how long the road may be for those who seek the truth. Now, as we reach the end of this chapter, I want to ask you to do something small but powerful that will honor the journey Eleanor has taken over the last 18 months. Please leave a single word in the comments that describes the feeling this story has left in your heart, or the moment that moved you the most during her transformation. Whether it is freedom, justice, or rebirth, your word helps us build a community of voices that refuse to stay silent in the face of betrayal. Reflect on the lessons we have learned together today, that your value is not determined by those who fail to see your worth, that the truth has a way of finding the light, even when it is buried behind false walls, that it is never too late to reclaim the masterpiece of your own life, that the people who try to erase you are often the ones most terrified of your potential. These truths are the anchors that will keep you steady when the winds of life try to blow you off your own cliff, reminding you that your strength is a resource that can never be fully exhausted by the greed of others who do not understand your power. Please share this story with someone in your life who needs to remember that their worth is not a transaction and that their best chapters are often written after the world thinks they have finished. Share it with a mother who feels invisible, a friend who is facing a difficult transition, or anyone who needs to know that a rusted key can still open the most magnificent doors if you only have the patience to scrub away the grime. Your engagement is the fuel that allows us to continue bringing these narratives of resilience and justice to life, proving that the human spirit is a masterpiece that can always be restored. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the stories that challenge the shadows and celebrate the light of the human experience. Thank you for being a part of this community and for lending your heart to the journey of Eleanor as she found her way home. We will continue to seek out the truth together, uncovering the beauty that hides in the quietest corners of the world. This is The Narrative,